Hello, my name is Matt Oswald, and this is going to be a quick video introducing you to CumulusVX and Vagrant. Now, there's a few other ways to run CumulusVX, but I'm focusing on Vagrant for this use case because I'm very familiar with Vagrant, and it gels nicely with my workflow. I use Vagrant as well as many other people, use Vagrant to repeatably and consistently set up test or development environments. This is not just a tool for software developers, it's really a tool for repeatably setting up environments of any kind from scratch, and being able to distribute that repeatability through simple text files. So you'll find Vagrant files in various GitHub repositories, or maybe distributed with things like CumulusVX or Junos. Juniper does the same thing with Vagrant. They've been doing that for a few months. And the benefit of that is you can distribute the configuration for an entire topology in a simple text file that's able to be edited extremely easily, just with a text editor and not with some sort of a GUI application. And that's sort of why I've been using Vagrant in networking and non-networking use cases. So head over to docs.cumulusnetworks.com, check out the documentation they have there. What I'll be doing is doing a quick walkthrough of how to set the environment up. So if you look, I have my VirtualBox instance. I have a few VMs, but none of them have to do with this. I have not created any of the Cumulus virtual machines yet. And I also have not downloaded, that's actually a lie, I totally have downloaded, but I've deleted entirely the Cumulus Networks repository from my file system. So I'm starting from scratch. The only caveat I would add there is there are a few steps that I have done prior to this, two specifically, and I'll outline them very quickly. Check out the documentation that I linked to earlier to figure out how to do this. But in essence, the two things that I've done, you can do a Vagrant plugin list. And as you can see, I've already installed the Cumulus Vagrant plugin. That's part of the walkthrough, so make sure you do that. And I also have installed the Cumulus Networks box. So you'll see a reference to a box, Cumulus-VX-2.5.3. That's already been done. So note, I just wanted to point out that I'm starting from this point. I'm not starting from scratch. I've already set this stuff up because it does take a little bit of time. So I've already done that. Make sure you do the same. Now, the things onto the things that I have not done. The first thing we need to do is grab the Cumulus Networks GitHub repository for VX. We can do that by typing git clone, and then here's the URL for the GitHub repo, but note that you have to have SSH authentication set up with GitHub in order to do this. If you would like, you can just simply copy in the HTTPS URL, which is that. Either one will work. We're not planning on pushing back, so no worries there. Although I highly recommend you use SSH with Git. It's much better. So now that we've done that, let's do a cd cumulus. Inside of this, you'll see we have a few directories. The only really thing that's interesting to us is Vagrant, and actually we want to go into demos. You'll see that we have 4 demos here. I actually have not yet looked at mlag or ccw.2s. I assume the mlag directory has a demo for mlag, but I actually could not tell you what ccw.2s does. Let's focus on setting up a class topology with BGP. Let's do cd class BGP. You'll see in this directory we have a few files. You can safely ignore gem file and rake file for now. Those, I believe, are specific to building the plugin for the Vagrant plugin for Cumulus. So I believe you can ignore those for now. What we'll be focusing on are the 2 YAML file and the Vagrant file. And I don't want to go into too much depth because it can be very easy to get into the weeds here, but I will do a quick tour of the Vagrant file and just hit some of the highlights. First off, you'll notice that we're importing the properties.yml file. I'll show you that very briefly, but just sort of understand. Actually, I will show you that now because that makes a lot more sense. Let's do that. Less properties.yml. So just because we've seen this, we notice that we're importing the .yml file, properties.yml file for essentially runtime variables. So if we look at that, you can see that we have num leaves, num spines, basically number of leaves, the number of spines that we want to provision, straightforward. Spine ASN and then leaf ASN base. We'll see where that comes in handy very shortly. and then IP adder prefix. These are all essentially variables that we're setting at runtime. What this means is if you want to change the parameters of the lab, you can very easily do so by simply changing these numbers. It's really nice to have the data separate from the Vagrant file, because the Vagrant file is a little complicated, and it's nice to be able to not have to change it. So now that we know what the properties.yml file, let's look back at our Vagrant file and note where those properties are being referenced. For instance, this is the line, or this block of code is what provisions our spines for us, and you can see it's calling properties and then the key num spines in order to provision the number of spines. So if we wanted to increase the number of spines, we could do that in the YAML file, and this Vagrant file will automatically pick that up. There's a few other things in here, most of which do configuration options for VirtualBox and for the virtual machines themselves. So that's sort of what this stuff does. If you look here on this block, this is an interesting block. This is the provisioner block. So Vagrant actually is able to work with Ansible as well as a few other tools. You can run shell scripts, you can run Puppet, you can run Chef. And what that does is it says, okay, well, you know, I've configured the virtual machine, but I need to configure the software on top of the virtual machine. And in our case, we'll need to configure things like Quagga. So Ansible works great for that. And Vagrant allows us to hook into Ansible to make that experience seamless, so that we don't actually have to run Ansible separately. We can run Vagrant, and Vagrant takes care of provisioning through Ansible. You can see that we're passing a few extra variables to Ansible based on our properties file. So we're taking the properties key IP adder prefix and spine ASN. You'll see that those are being passed to Ansible at runtime. We'll note that those are in our runbook. And you can see here that we're simply referring to our playbook file. That's what I meant, not runbook, playbook. You'll see that we're referring to our playbook file here, clbgp.yml. So lastly, let's take a look at that, because that's where all of the magic happens in terms of configuring the switch. clbgp.yml. The top level node here, the hyphen, indicates this is the play of this playbook. There's only one, I believe. Pretty sure. Yeah, it looks like it. So one play. The name of this play is configure BGP unnumbered. Hosts all, that's a very common thing to do for Ansible if running within Vagrant, because Vagrant takes care of our inventory for us. First task, you'll notice that I'm that Cumulus has written this playbook to assign an IP address to the loopback. We're enabling BGP and Zebra. We're writing our ASN into bgp.conf. This is using actually, no, sorry. The enable BGPD and Zebra. This is using a module called replace. I love this module. It's super, super helpful for doing text replaces. And as you can see, we're setting BGPD and Zebra to no, or rather, we're saying when it is no, we're setting it to yes. So we're changing it from no to yes. Writing our ASN into bgpd.conf, pretty straightforward. We're saying I want this ASN into the BGPD configuration. We're then restarting Quagga. This could and should probably be handled by a handler, but that's not a big deal. Assign router ID. What we're doing here is we're running the cl-bgp tool, which is super helpful for making changes at runtime. We're setting the router ID that way. You'll notice on the next one we're actually doing IPv6, which is great. Kudos to Cumulus for setting this up from the get-go, not waiting for somebody else to do it. So that's awesome. You'll notice also the next play starts BGP on all the active interfaces with a few nested commands. This is pretty complicated Ansible, but in essence, what it's doing is it's going through and it's adding BGP neighbors for each interface. Since it is unnumbered, it does that on a per interface basis. And then finally, announcing the loopback IP address, we're saying CLBGP network add, and then the loopback IP. You'll remember that this is what was provided in our vars file from before. So that's a very quick tour. Now, if you can think about what you might run into with respect to setting up Vagrant, you'll be running into this directory, and this is the directory that you should be in order to set this demo up. You can do a really quick Vagrant status. You'll see that not only do the virtual machines, they just totally don't exist. So the first thing we want to do is type Vagrant up. And what's going to happen is for every instance that's described in the Vagrant file, and if you remember, because of our vars file, there will be 4 virtual machines, which makes sense. S1, S2, L1, and L2 for spines and leaves. And what that's going to do for us is it's going to bring those 4 virtual machines up. That's what it's doing right now. Right now it's doing all of the SSH key authentication or exchange, setting all of that up so that we can log in seamlessly. The next thing that will happen for each virtual machine is it's going to call Ansible, which is what's happening right now. And very, 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 very quickly, we are configuring BGP unnumbered on that switch. And that's it. We're now on to the second virtual machine. The second virtual machine is going to undergo the same exact changes, and it's going to go from spine 1, and now it's on spine 2, and then it'll do leaf 1 and leaf 2. I'm going to pause the video to essentially wait for the rest of these to finish, and then I will unpause after they have finished. Okay, and that is it. We have configured all 4 Cumulus devices, or virtual machines, and what we can do now is say Vagrant Status, and you'll see that all 4 are running. Now that's all great, but let's actually get into one of the virtual machines, one of the Cumulus instances, and check out exactly what happened. If we do Vagrant SSH S1, we can automatically authenticate into the virtual machine S1, and we can get into Quagga, sudo vtysh. You'll see that we're in the Quagga CLI now. We can do show IP BGP. 10.0.1.1, 10.0.1.3, 10.0.1.4. All of those are being advertised, the local, and then the two remotes for the leaves. So that's actually super, super, super cool. Let's see actually the neighbor relationships now. Let's see, show IP BGP sum, and you can see we have the 2 neighbors. So awesome. So essentially, let's just take a step back and remember exactly what it took to get here. Step 1 was to clone the GitHub repository, which we did. Once we cd into this directory, we can say vagrant up, and it provisions all of the virtual machines. And because it's calling Ansible, it's not only provisioning the virtual machines, but it's also configuring BGP on top of that. So it's super, super easy for us to get our lab started. And it's just as easy to distribute that same lab, and because of these tools, guaranteeing that somebody else has that same exact experience, distributing them through something as simple as GitHub. So that's just a very quick demo. I wanted to do a very high level dive into Vagrant and Ansible being used for this purpose. There's a lot of details to go over. I highly encourage that you check out the blog posts that I write on this topic. I've written a few blog posts, not only on Cumulus, but also using Vagrant with a few other vendors. I'm seeing that this is an interesting trend, and I'm a fan. I actually really like Vagrant, and it's a nice form factor for distributing test dev environments. And I'm glad that networking is starting to take advantage of that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.